There is a massive economic and societal crisis going on in Sri Lanka. I don't think it's getting enough coverage for how monumental it is. So pretty much due to years of buildup to a massive economic crisis and a massive economic issue, they have now, plus the addition of the pandemic and all of the economic problems that caused, they had an economic meltdown that was wildly mismanaged, this whole process by the government, leading to terrible economic conditions over there, as well as now violent uprisings against the government. So we're going to be doing a lot of reading on this, but please bear with me, because again, these stories are never the ones that are going to get the most views and all that type of stuff, but it is important that we keep up with what's going on around the world and be knowledgeable about it. So reading from CNN, Sri Lanka, an island nation of 22 million, is facing an economic and political crisis, with protesters taking to the streets in defiance of curfews and government ministers stepping down in mass. We're going to get to a video after we get through this article of mass amount of protesters storming one of their government buildings and taking it over. Wild stuff. Driving the discontent is the worst economic downturn since the South Asian country gained independence in 1948. The worst economic downturn since Sri Lanka gained independence in 1948. That's wild. With crippling inflation sending the cost of basic goods skyrocketing. Anger, which has been simmering for weeks, boiled over last Thursday, turning protests violent and throwing the government into disorder. Experts say the crisis has been years in the making, driven by a little bad luck and a lot of government mismanagement. So we're going to walk through what caused this economic crisis, which led to now the violent riots and the takeover of this government building. And then we'll watch the video. Over the past decade, the Sri Lankan government has borrowed vast sums of money from foreign lenders to fund public services. This borrowing spree has coincided with a series of hammer blows to the Sri Lankan economy, from both natural disasters, such as heavy monsoons, to man-made catastrophes, including a government ban on chemical fertilizers that decimated farmers' harvests. These problems were compounded in 2018 when the president's dismissal of the prime minister sparked a constitutional crisis the following year, when hundreds of people at churches and luxury hotels were killed in the 2019 Easter bombings, and from 2020 onwards with the arrival of the COVID-19 pandemic. As you can see, just layer after layer of economic problem that is going to lead to a disastrous situation over there. Facing a massive deficit, the president slashed taxes in a doomed attempt to stimulate the economy. Of course, these leaders see a bad economic situation and go, hey, this is a perfect time to cut taxes for my rich buddies. I don't know if it was just for the rich, but it reminds me too much of that. But the move backfired, instead hitting government revenue. That prompted rating agencies to downgrade Sri Lanka to near default levels, meaning the country lost access to overseas markets. Sri Lanka then had to fall back on its foreign exchange reserves to pay off government debt, shrinking its reserves from 6.9 billion in 2018 to 2.2 billion this year. This impacted imports of fuel and other essentials, which sent prices soaring. Topping all of that, bear with me, the government in March floated the Sri Lankan rupee, meaning its price was determined based on the demand and supply of foreign exchange markets. That move appeared aimed at devaluing the currency to qualify for a loan from the International Monetary Fund and encourage remittances. However, the plunging of the rupee against the US dollar only made things worse for ordinary Sri Lankans. So all of this leads to a situation where people are having to wait in lines to get food, having a terrible time getting access to basic needs, stores shutting down, all of these issues. And then, as you can imagine, because we're experiencing economic problems in the United States, but in a country that was already dealing with all of that, doesn't have the economic prosperity already that the United States has, but then you layer on all these problems and the pandemic happens, so then they get hit with what all these other countries are hit with, and it just absolutely devolves into a terrible situation for Sri Lankans. So that culminated to mass protests against the government, because a lot of this was due to their mismanagement, leading to this, the storming of the presidential palace. Look at this. So for our podcast listeners, picture a fancy government building, presidential palace, with just more people than you could possibly imagine all around it. Look at that. So again, I just think it's important to keep in touch with what's going on across the world. And remember, when we experience the effects of a global economic issue, there are countries out there, not to discount the pain that Americans are going through, but there are countries out there that get hit so much harder and cause a situation where people aren't even able to get access to basic needs and are revolting against their government, and a complete disaster where now, of course, the leaders are fleeing and they're in exile and aren't leading their country through this crisis. So very unclear how they're going to move forward, very unclear how they're going to get pulled out of this, how they're going to pull themselves out of it. But all the positive thoughts, that I possibly could be sending to Sri Lankans, I am. Hopefully there's some light at the end of the tunnel somehow. But right now there's a lot of devastation, a huge crisis going on in Sri Lanka.